For the past several centuries, the Confederacy of Nations, known as the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse of the Eastern Great Lakes, have been guided by the principles of the Great Law, which is the social, political, and spiritual center of their communities, led by the clan mothers and hereditary chiefs. Despite successfully upholding their traditions for generations, by the early 20th century, Haudenosaunee communities and Indigenous communities across Canada were witnessing an intense series of attacks on their historic institutions by the Canadian government. Through a series of laws, policies, including the Indian Act and involuntary enfranchisement, and various forms of intimidation and violence, the Canadian government sought to assimilate Indigenous peoples, secure their lands, and eliminate their sovereignty. Indigenous communities across the country responded in different ways to these elimination tactics. In Six Nations of the Grand River, a Haudenosaunee community in southern Ontario, the Hereditary Confederacy Council, understanding the Canadian government's actions as a direct attack on their self-determination, responded by leading a series of national and international appeals to gain recognition of their sovereignty. Building upon over a century of Haudenosaunee activism, the community leaders first unsuccessfully appealed to the House of Commons in Ottawa in 1920 through their legal counsel. Undeterred, the Confederacy Council intensified their approach and decided to make an international appeal the following year. To do so, they selected Levi General with the hereditary title Deskaheh to travel to England and be their public spokesperson, appointing him as Speaker of the Six Nations Council in 1921. In their pursuit of gaining international recognition for their Haudenosaunee sovereignty, General and the Confederacy Council hired a lawyer from Rochester, New York, named George Decker. Traveling on his newly created Haudenosaunee passport as a further manifestation of their independent status, General traveled to London, England in 1921, where he presented the Confederacy Council's case to the Colonial Office in London, only to be brushed aside. Told that the Haudenosaunee grievance was a domestic concern and already rebuffed by Ottawa. General returned to Six Nations, where the Confederacy Council began planning a new and more prominent international appeal. In order to raise money for their legal counsel and the international appeal, General and various longhouses in Six Nations would host exceedingly popular lacrosse games in the community in the early 1920s, games that were deemed illegal under Canadian law due to a ban on Sunday activities. Together, the Department of Indian Affairs, the Attorney General of Ontario, and an organization known as the Lord's Day Alliance all attempted to stop the Six Nations community from organizing these games. Despite threats of arrests and fines, Deskaheh and the Confederacy Council continued to host the popular games as a performative protest to further assert their self-determination, attracting thousands of paying non-Indigenous spectators. The lacrosse controversy illustrated the many ways in which colonialism was masked and how Indigenous communities responded creatively to maintain their self-determination. With the help of funds raised from the games, in addition to raising money through bonds, General returned to Europe in the summer of 1923 to make his grandest appeal yet. This time, the Confederacy Council had the intent of bringing forth the Haudenosaunee case to the League of Nations, an organization located in Geneva, Switzerland, and formed after World War I to resolve international disputes. It was here, armed with a pamphlet known as The Red Man's Appeal for Justice, a silver peace pipe, and the friendship and 2-row wampum belts, General hoped to gain the support of international leaders to further recognize the Haudenosaunee sovereignty and their right to self-determination. After his arrival in Geneva, General would begin to captivate audiences across Western Europe, traveling to various cities and lecturing in front of crowds of a few hundred to a few thousand on any given night. During his lectures, he detailed the Haudenosaunee sovereign status, their history, and the colonial tactics of the Canadian state. To be seen, heard, and thought of as an Indigenous person at the time, General had to meet the stereotypical expectations of his audience and play Indian, which included wearing a Plains headdress. As all of this was a great embarrassment to the Canadian government and Department of Indian Affairs led by Duncan Campbell Scott, Canadian officials proceeded to attempt to discredit General's efforts and target the Confederacy Council and its supporters. As part of their response, Canadian officials established an RCMP detachment in Six Nations in 1922, leading to several confrontations and police harassment. In the following year, while Deskaheh was in Europe, Scott maneuvered to remove the Confederacy Council's authority, further imposing the Indian Act in the community, as the federal government did with communities across the country, and looked to replace the hereditary Confederacy Council with the fully elected Chief and Council. Scott found support for this change in government in a small but vocal group in Six Nations. Because hereditary chiefs among the Haudenosaunee wore deer antlers as part of their headdress as a sign and symbol of their authority, the group at Six Nations who advocated for the elected system were known as dehorners. All of this came to a head on October 7, 1924, when Indian agent Colonel C.E. Morgan, under the instruction from Scott and Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King, read an order in council removing the Confederacy Council from power. The RCMP ascended upon the council meeting to disband the hereditary leadership, confiscated a bag of wampum and various other documents, and Morgan proceeded to post a proclamation announcing the banned council elections under the Indian Act for October 21, 1924. Despite the Canadian government's expulsion of the leadership in Six Nations, the Confederacy Council continued on and remained active following the events of 1924. Although they were no longer recognized as the official governing body in the community, and the consequences of the Canadian government's forced removal of the council would reverberate for generations. Still in Geneva at the time of the removal of the Confederacy Council, General continued to actively pursue an audience with the League of Nations. Finding some support among European audiences and their leadership, Canada and Great Britain actively suppressed General's appeal to the League by portraying it as a domestic concern to international leaders, furthering their assertion that the Haudenosaunee were subjects of the British Crown and a Dominion of Canada. Despite centuries of international relations proving otherwise, including treaty relationships such as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, Canada was ultimately successful in rebutting General's appeal and convincing League members not to pursue the matter further. Gravely ill and forced into exile in the United States by the Canadian government, General left Geneva in January 1925, returning to Rochester, New York, where he would deliver one of his most passionate and ultimately last speeches of his life. On March 10, 1925, General would appear on the radio in Rochester, making one last appeal.
We are tired of calling on the governments of pale-faced peoples in America and in Europe. We've tried that and found it was no use. They deal only in fine words. We want something more than that. We want justice from now on. After all that has happened to us, that is not much for us to ask. The governments at Washington and at Ottawa have a silent partnership of policy. It's aimed to break up every tribe of redmen so as to dominate every acre of their territory. Over in Ottawa, they call that policy Indian advancement. Over in Washington, they call it assimilation. We, who would be the helpless victims, say it's tyranny.
In the wake of the League of Nations appeal and following General's death on June 27, 1925, other prominent Haudenosaunee rights activists would continue the work of the Confederacy Council. In 1926, Clinton Rickard, David Hill, and Sophie Martin all co-founded the Haudenosaunee rights organization, the Indian Defense League. In the following year, Paul K. Daibo successfully fought for Haudenosaunee border crossing rights in U.S. federal court. And in 1930, Emily General traveled to London, England with a small group of community members to further reassert the Haudenosaunee right to self-determination and later became a critical advocate for Indigenous controlled education in the community of Six Nations. While General and the Confederacy Council were not successful in gaining an official international endorsement of the Haudenosaunee sovereignty at the time, Deskaheh Levi General would leave a remarkable legacy, one that can still be felt today on the 100th anniversary of his travels to the League of Nations.
Now I wish I knew your name, so that I could find your grave, and I'd sing your ghostly soul, and I'd tell you you were wrong. with her husband's. Yes, she's in the back seat, calling that box by his first name. She refused to say goodbye, not even after flames. And I want a love like that, through the thick and through the thin. And I want a love that lasts through the thick and through the thin. Across the ocean, through the storm, across the desert and the sun. Now all my love was left me, every single word, every single word. Now I wish I